See, this is different from the 80 other times I've talked about Nintendo handhelds because now I'm wearing black. Listen, man, it's 12:46 p.m. I just got coffee, and you know what I want to do? I just want to talk about what I think about certain Nintendo handhelds because it's 12:46. I do this every day at 12:46. I'm going to be talking about all the different models of Nintendo handhelds. So, we're going to go through Game Boy and Game Boy Pocket and Game Boy Light because that's how we do things around here. How am I going to be ranking these things? Well, it's kind of based on the library of the system, the legacy, just how fun it is to play these days, but also the handheld itself, does it feel good to play? Like, does it hold up? Is it usable? It's going to be an amalgamation of different factors. But keep in mind, I am doing this off the cuff, so you're gonna get pissed off. And I don't blame you for that. I pissed myself off. Watch this, I'm gonna put new 2DS XL in A tier. I don't know why, that just pisses me off why I did that. It's just in my nature to do this stuff, so don't take it too seriously. Stupid fucking opinions are just in my nature. So, let's talk about Game & Watch. S tier. I kid. I do really respect the Game & Watch. I think a lot of Game & Watch games do hold up in the context of what they are. Have you ever played other like LCD games, like a Tiger Electronics game? Like, those are god-awful. Not only are they boring and not fun to play and confusing, and also just the design of them at their core, it isn't good. Game & Watch games, on the other hand, they feel like genuine, like, actual games using like LCD screen technology, really making the most out of like nothing. Feels like they really did think through the fact that it's just like, hey, we have very limited technology to make these games, so we have to design the game around that and try to make a fun, high score based experience with basically a calculator screen. And you know what? Damn it, I think they did that. I haven't played a single Game & Watch game that I think is like, oh wow, like this is ass. Pretty much every Game & Watch game I play, I'm like, well, that's cute. And then I move on after 5 minutes. But overall, like, I think Game & Watch holds up, and let me finish this, for what it is. And on top of that, the build quality of these things is phenomenal. They feel like a genuine, like a really nice pocket watch, like a really rich guy has. Like, all Game & Watch units, like, feel like that. They just feel like such a premium little experience. And the fact, hey, there's also a watch involved, so that's big. I'm never really hankering to play a Game & Watch, but I will say, like, if a Game & Watch is handed to me or is in my general vicinity, I might pick it up and be like, hey, I'm down to just give this a little try. And, I do so, and I'm like, yeah, it's a fun little, cute little thing. Of course, it's kind of hard to rank these amongst everything else because it's not like the Game & Watch is like a system with a vast library of games. These are single game unit devices. You have to own like 80 different Game & Watches to own all the Game & Watch games. So it's kind of here just based on like seniority. And like I said, like, I respect the hell out of Game & Watch games, and you can have your fun with them, but it is more of a novelty, if anything. I think just based on all of that, I feel comfortable dumping this in the high end of C tier. And keep in mind, I'm being nice here. If you ever see anybody ranking the Nintendo handhelds and they put Game & Watch in F tier, I don't think they have a heart. But what does that put me if I put the Pokemon Mini down in D tier? Doesn't just mean I don't have a heart, I'm goddamn soulless. Yeah, so I actually own a fair amount of like Pokemon Mini stuff. I know I own a couple of units. I own like 1 or 2 in the box, and then I have a couple of the games, some North American releases, some Japanese releases. This is a really cute little handheld, but overall, like, I really have always failed to see the point of this. So first off, this does count as a Nintendo handheld. It is produced by Nintendo. It is a dedicated handheld with different game cartridges that, you pop in. And overall, this does kind of feel like, it's just Nintendo's take on the Tamagotchi, but, let's theme it around Pokemon. So what we have here is a Pokemon-themed game console with nothing but Pokemon mini games on it. The technology behind this thing is pretty rad. Like, it has like an accelerometer, which is pretty cool, especially because like this released in like the early 2000s. And the screen is like oddly clear on this. It's all black and white, and it's a very tiny display. You have, a tiny D-pad, tiny buttons. It has vibration. It has like one single little shoulder button. There's a lot of weird little things about this, and the games itself, like there's a couple, you know, fun little time wasters on it, but it's kind of strange, you know. It's almost like, you know, like imagine basing an entire game console off of a single franchise, yet the only games available on said game console are nothing like, you know, the core traditional games in that game franchise. It's just a bunch of like Pokemon themed party games, mini games, spin-offs. Like, it's cool. I'm not gonna act like it isn't cool, but it's like, what are we doing here? I feel like, you know, taking the Tamagotchi form factor and kind of trying to make like a dedicated game console out of that, where you have like interchangeable game cartridges, I feel like, you know, it kind of defeats the purpose of that form factor. You know, it's kind of just meant to be like a singular little small little novel thing, like, oh yeah, I have my little thing here with my digital pet, or this one little thing on it, and the fact that now you have like game cartridges the size of like micro SD cards, and it's just like you have to pick and choose which game you want to play on this handheld, that it's like you didn't buy this because you want to play like actual video games. Like, you kind of bought this because you're a mega fan of Pokemon and you wanted something kind of cute. At this point, I just kind of feel like that's like, why even do like a dedicated game console at that point? Just do like a singular little digital pet thing like Tamagotchi. In fact, they did that before this. There was like a little handheld called the Pokemon Pikachu, which was kind of like exactly that. It was like a little digital pet thing. I actually don't know a lot about that one at all. I know a lot more about the Pokemon Mini. But at that point, I'm just kind of like, yeah, it just kind of felt like they wanted to take the next big step with Pokemon Pikachu and do the Pokemon Mini. It's like a digital pet thing, but we're doing a full-blown game console, and just feels like some things don't need to take that giant step into the next direction. You don't need to like add all this stuff, you know. Like, the entire appeal of this kind of stuff is that it's like pretty dedicated. So yeah, I like the Pokemon Mini. I think it's funny. It's the worst Nintendo handheld. But wait, I put the Virtual Boy on here, not because it's a handheld, but it's kind of portable, I guess. So why not? We'll include this in here. The Virtual Boy is actually the worst Nintendo handheld, and it's not even a handheld. Who would have thunk that? I wish I had kind of a unique opinion on this. I think it's mainly down to like, hey, you know, I've played pretty much, I have played every Virtual Boy game. There's only like 3 that I'm missing. I'm missing like 3 Japan-only games, and they're like impossible to find. So, you know, I'll never sleep at night, but I'm okay with that. But yeah, the main thing I really took away from the Virtual Boy library is that there's not really a ton of like bad games in it, you know? Like, a lot of the games are like perfectly fine games. Like, even the games I don't really like you have Mario's Tennis on Virtual Boy. That game's awful. But for what it is, it's a fine tennis game from 1995. I don't know, and you have it in 3D, you know? Like, that was a big deal. And that's the thing, the 3D does work on Virtual Boy. It works fairly okay. It's pretty much like exactly what the Nintendo 3DS's 3D screen kind of feels like, I guess. Maybe not exactly like, but, you know, it is pretty crazy that Nintendo revisited that idea, and yeah, it was fairly similar to how they did it back in the day, at least in terms of like how the, you know, depth in the games kind of worked, I guess. The controller, in my opinion, is actually a pretty damn good controller. I love the feel of the buttons and just the feel of the controller itself. Like, the mold of it is quite damn good, to be honest. It's not perfect, there's a couple of weird little things with it, but, you know, overall, like, playing the Virtual Boy, I mean, it's not comfortable, God no, but, like, it isn't the worst thing in the world. It comes down to the fact that, like, there's no real comfortable way to play the Virtual Boy. Just sticking your head in that thing is, like, the worst. Like, I think genuinely the best way to do it is laying on your back, having, like, the Virtual Boy, like, pretty much just spilling onto your eyes. That's the most comfortable way for me to play, and even then, that sucks. The thing with the Virtual Boy is, it was unfinished. You know, Nintendo kind of rushed it to market just to get something out because the Nintendo 64 was taking so long to release. They were just like, well, this Virtual Boy is kind of neat enough, and we need something out there in 1995, so let's just push that out. But none of the games are really worth a damn. There's good games on it, and none of them are, like, terrible. Like, Virtual Boy Wario Land is good. Mario Clash, you know, it's just pretty much like an endurance-based arcade game. So it's fine. Jag Brothers is a solid game, and that's like the rarest game in North America. Like, 3D Tetris is interesting. Talro Boxer, that's pretty cool. I like the Virtual Boy library decent enough. Like, it has some solid stuff in it. Now, is it really worth getting a Virtual Boy to experience it? Hell no. I don't really think the 3D really enhances any of these experiences. It's cool, but it's not necessary whatsoever. I would really just recommend, like, if you're dying to play a Virtual Boy game, check it out on, like, an emulator, or you can hack a 3DS, and you can put a Virtual Boy emulator with ROMs on the 3DS, and the 3D works on there, which is pretty neat. But even then, man, like, I would say none of these games are necessarily, like, really, like, oh my god, you haven't played Nestor's Funky Bowlin'? What? It's unfortunate. I wish I had more of a unique opinion here, but yeah, you know, I think the Virtual Boy deserves to be at the bottom of the barrel right now. But what about the Game Boy Micro? Oh, the cute little Game Boy Micro. I'm going after all the failures right now. I love the Game Boy Micro. I think it's such a cute little thing. But honestly speaking, like, you know, I gotta kind of think, like, where do you put this thing? Because, like, the hardware itself is pretty nice. Like, I love the aesthetic. I love how it feels. Obviously, like, it's not the most, like, comfortable Game Boy to play because, you know, it is ungodly small. The screen is really tiny, but it's damn bright. I mean, like, that screen is fantastic. And because of how small it is, like, all the games look incredibly crisp on it. Of course, you know, with a smaller screen, it makes it a little harder to, like, see everything, like, read the text as well as you could on, like, maybe a Game Boy Advance SP. But, you know, I've never really had a huge problem with how small the Game Boy Micro is. Now, the Game Boy Micro came out, and it kind of felt like it was a bit of an experiment to see if they could keep, you know, the Nintendo DS and Game Boy Advance running at the exact same time. You know, the DS released in 2004 and then the Game Boy Micro released in 2005. And yeah, man, like, I think this thing is like a super cool little handheld, you know, like, but that's the thing, like, that's all it is. Like, this is a handheld. It's not really about the functionality. It's more so about, like, the style of it. You know, you could interchange the faceplates, you could swap those out. That was pretty neat. And just having, like, a tiny little Game Boy to go in your pocket at all times, like, I think that was really cool. It's really obvious that, like, this was trying to go after kind of that iPod Nano style of marketing, or just kind of that market of people that, you know, they don't really need, like, the all-in-one giant thing, like let's say, like, the traditional bigger iPod. They were down for, like, you know, an iPod that was more compact, a little smaller, a little cooler. You know, the iPod Nano always had some cooler color options, for example. But, you know, it did have, like, smaller storage capacities, and, you know, that comparison with the Game Boy Micro is the Game Boy Micro could only play Game Boy Advance games. You couldn't play, you know, original Game Boy or Game Boy Color, which just kind of made this a little weird, because the Nintendo DS also couldn't play Game Boy or Game Boy Color games, and the Game Boy Micro isn't called the Game Boy Advance Micro, it's just called, you know. And I believe at the time in 2005, the original Nintendo DS retailed for $150. The Game Boy Micro was $100. That doesn't make any sense. For $50 more, you get, like, twice as many games available. You could play the entire Nintendo DS library for $50 more, and you get everything you get with a Nintendo DS, and you get to play Game Boy Advance games on that thing. You know, you get the brand new handheld with all the new games releasing for a Game Boy Advance at this point, you know, obviously slowing down a little bit, so this didn't really make a ton of sense at the end of the day. I think it would have made a lot more sense if this could play, like, original Game Boy Color games, because then this kind of feels like it would have been, like, you know, it would have given, like, the Game Boy line a bit of a new life. You know, it's just like, hey, like, you know, you can play all these games, all these classic games, and all these, you know, relatively recent games, like the Game Boy Advance games, on this one small, compact, cool-ass little portable. But no, it was just, like, Game Boy Advance games, and it does that damn well. But, yeah, you know, it makes sense that the Game Boy Micro didn't do that crazy well. I think it sold, like, 2 to 3 million, which for what it is, like, you kind of think about it, and it's like, That's pretty good for, like, just being, like, kind of like this, you know, hey, let's try to do something new with the Game Boy, as we're, you know, obviously moving into the DS generation. But still, you know, it wasn't enough to keep the Game Boy line alive, and this was the last official Game Boy release. A pretty fun one to go out on, I will definitely say. I really like the Game Boy Micro, but, you know, kind of my choice for Game Boy Advance will always be, you know, the traditional Game Boy Advance SP. Game Boy Micro is kind of if I'm feeling a little quirky that day. The Game Boy Advance library itself is good. You know, Game Boy Advance had some stellar games on it. But at the same time, you know, like, you look at this, and it has to be worse than the Game Boy Advance SP. It just has to. Yeah, the screen is brighter, but, like, so? Buddy, we still have to rank the original Game Boy models, and those barely even have a screen. Honestly, I think we have to go high C. A little above the Game & Watch, but, you know, like, it's something where the Game Boy Micro is a very cool little handheld, but that's kind of all it is, you know? I just feel like there's always better options out there for you. Like, the Game Boy Micro is what you get if you already have, like, a Game Boy Advance SP and all of that, you know? A Game Boy Micro is more of like you get that when you have too much money to spend. Alright, man, I'm looking to go a little modern here. What I have here is the Nintendo Switch Lite. I'm not putting the regular Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch OLED edition and all the other crap like that. Like, no. I want to do the Nintendo Switch Lite because this is a dedicated Nintendo handheld. It is handheld only. It is the evolution of what came prior, and it is going in good old A tier. And why is that? Well, I think the Nintendo Switch Lite, obviously, like, I do kind of feel like the reasons why I put it in A tier instead of S tier, because, like, here's the thing, man. It feels lame as hell. Like, I feel like I am just Nintendo's biggest little fanboy if I'm like, the Nintendo Switch is the best console of all time. But, like, I'm gonna begrudgingly say stuff like that at this point where I'm like, it just feels like you're just kind of lying to yourself if you're saying, like, Nintendo Switch isn't that great. There's not a lot of great games on it. And, yeah, honestly, like, I just don't really care. No, I don't think the Nintendo Switch was a perfect generation whatsoever. But, you know, it gets to a point that, like, you look at all of the games released for it, all of the games Nintendo themselves put out on this thing, and it's just getting to a point that I'm like, yeah, you know, they really locked down and just pumped out a bunch of stuff this generation. Some of it was Endless Ocean Luminous, and some of it was good. But, like, yeah, you know, I'd say the Nintendo Switch is definitely up there as, like, yeah, it's one of the best Nintendo consoles, if not the best Nintendo console at this point. But again, I begrudgingly say that. I don't have a lot of passion in my voice when I'm saying that. So why is the Nintendo Switch Lite on A tier? Well, it is, you know, it is obviously, like, a lesser Nintendo Switch. I would always recommend people to get, like, a normal Nintendo Switch, because, like, I don't know. It's like when the PS5 had the digital edition and you couldn't just get, like, the disc drive attachment with that. You know, hey, you're saving $100 initially, but it's just like you're locking yourself out from ever possibly wanting to, like, use a disc on that thing. And that's the same with the Switch Lite. Yeah, you're saving $100, but you're locking yourself out of ever being able to plug this into the TV. And there's genuinely no reason why you shouldn't be able to just maybe buy, like, a separate Switch Lite dock or something and be able to plug it into a TV. Hell, they could have overcharged for it. If they charged $100 for a Nintendo Switch Lite dock, honestly, I might have thrown this in S tier because I just want the option to be able to do that. If you buy a Switch Lite, I think it would be nice if you had the option to buy, like, an accessory to allow you to play this on the TV. Because as it is, also, like, the Switch Lite isn't super easily compatible with, you know, a handful of some of the biggest Switch games out there. Yes, you can technically play stuff like Ring Fit Adventure on it, and Super Mario Party and 1-2 Switch and all that crap. But at the same time, they make it really awkward to play those games on here. Like, why doesn't the Switch Lite just have, like, a really basic kickstand? So then you can prop it up and you can sit it down and you can play games with external controllers with the device. Why can't I just buy a separate dock or something? You don't have to include it in the package. That's why the Switch Lite is, you know, more affordable. You don't have the dock included. But just give me the option to buy a dock later down the line. Instead, if you buy a Switch Lite and you eventually want to plug it into the TV, fuck you, buddy. Just buy a normal Switch for another $300. The fact of the matter is, the Switch Lite is basically just a lesser Switch in almost every way, except for the feel. I love how the Switch Lite feels. I vastly prefer the feel, like the buttons and all that stuff. Just how the handheld just feels in the hand. Even there's a tinier screen. I think it all just feels a lot nicer. But you know, just the fact that like it's, you know, like you can't do a lot of the Switch things that, you know, make a Switch, or like play a lot of games, even if they're lame ass games. Like I'm just like, you know, the Switch Lite, I think I can't put it in S tier, because it's just like, I'd be lying to myself. Do I really look at the Switch Lite and I go like, that's the best damn Nintendo handheld of all time? Nope. I love the design of the Switch Lite. I think it feels great, and you know, it has a stellar library at the end of the day. It's a great way to play like a couple of Switch games. If you're just somebody who just wants to play a couple Switch games, you don't really want to get that into the ecosystem. You're just like, hey, I kind of want to play Mario, I kind of want to play Zelda, I kind of want to play like Animal Crossing, but you know, I don't want to like invest that much into this thing. Switch Lite is great, man. I'd recommend that to a lot of casual people. But at the same time, I'd also say, like, yeah, like, you may be like, I'm never going to play it on the TV. It's good to have that option if you want it, you know? So yeah, I'd say Switch Lite in A tier. Now, when it comes to S tier, oh man, what is like one of the best Nintendo hands? You know what? Let's go into it. Let's talk some 3DS. I'm gonna go with the new 3DS and the new 3DS XL. That's right, we're going two! I think both the new 3DS and new 3DS XL are the best definitive versions of the 3DS systems you could possibly buy. And when I take a look at like everything you can do with a 3DS, even without like, you know, going on the eShop, which you can't do anymore, so you know, you gotta get a little hacky with this thing. But yeah, just being able to play like the full 3DS library and also the full DS library, and for it to just feel a lot better, you know, playing 3DS games on the new 3DS XL just feels really damn good. Like the games just feel a lot better, everything loads a lot faster, the menu system is way better. It's just a more powerful 3DS, and damn it, you needed that after like, what was it, like 3 years of like, you know, like that fucking thing. Now what's kind of neat is the new 3DS systems have their own lineup of games. All like what, like 5 of them? Yeah, they are completely superfluous to this discussion. It's like what, Xenoblade Chronicles 3D, which, you know, that's kind of cool. But even at the time, you know, like it's more cool that like Xenoblade Chronicles 3D worked. Like that is a game that like I don't think anybody really looked at and was like, oh yeah, that'll work on the 3DS. Felt like that game was almost more of just a show off. Hey, we can do this. It doesn't look that great, but it works. We can put Xenoblade on the 3DS. At that point, like I feel like pretty much most like bigger Wii games to some extent would have like worked on the 3DS. You know, you would have had to downgrade the hell out of them in many ways, but hey, if you can get Xenoblade to run, you can get anything to run, but like that's whatever. There was like Minecraft, Runbow, Fire Emblem Warriors. I think that's it. The new 3DS had a lot more exclusives over on the eShop. You had stuff like the Binding of Isaac. Then you also had all of the Super Nintendo games. You know, you could download Super Nintendo games on the Virtual Console, which was dumb. You know, there's no reason why Super Nintendo games couldn't work on the original 3DS. So, you know, the fact that they made those new 3DS exclusives just kind of felt like they were really struggling to, like, give you anything that was, like, a benefit to upgrading to the new 3DS. Outside the fact that, like, yeah, you know, it genuinely was a much better experience. And you know what? Damn it, I love the design of the regular size new 3DS. It looks fucking delicious. I love the colored buttons. I love, like, the white look, the black look, the fact that you have interchangeable faceplates on the back. I love that they did that. There's so many cool things with that. And then the new 3DS XL, I'm not a fan of the, you know, the back of it is like very glossy. The inside at the very least is like a matte finish. You know, I do very much prefer matte finishes on my handhelds. But the new 3DS XL does look very nice. You know, it feels like a very premium 3DS. And you know, just the fact that like, yeah, you can play everything on here. The fact that the Circle Pad Pro is included via that little lion nipple, whatever that thing is. That thing isn't like amazing. It's kind of just like, I don't know. I still don't really know why Nintendo couldn't have just put like a second Circle Pad below the face buttons on the 3DS. Instead, they had to like put this little nub at the top of the face buttons. In fact, there's like even like a little like there's like a little indent on the hinge of the 3DS So then, you know, like the nub doesn't like rub up against it. There's a couple of weird things with that. And the nub is okay. It's pretty much only good for like camera control. That's the whole reason why it is called the C stick. You know, kind of bringing that back from like the GameCube days. You know, the second analog stick on that was just the C stick. But hey, it's there, and you don't need that giant ass soap dish boat that the original 3DS and 3DS XL had with the Circle Pad Pro. I'd say there's only like 3 major problems with these things. One, the names are dumb. So you have the original 3DS, and then after that you had the 3DS XL, which was bigger, and then the 2DS came after, which was a stripped down version of the 3DS that had no hinge, no 3D, looks like a doorstop, and then after that you have the new 3DS and new 3DS XL, which are kind of like the enhanced 3DS and 3DS XL units, and then after that you have the new 2DS XL, which is pretty much like the enhanced new 3DS XL, but you have no 3D screen, and it also looks kind of dumb. I would have preferred like 3DS Plus or 3DS XL Plus, even though that's still kind of like a weird name considering like you're already naming this like 3DS XL, and Plus also implies that it's bigger. So like, I don't know. But alright, that's one of my problems. Second problem isn't that major at this point because, you know, we're not really buying these new in box at the store anymore. But the fact that these originally didn't come with, you know, chargers, it's just kind of lame. You know, yes, at this point, the 3DS line all use the exact same charging bricks. In fact, they were the same charging bricks used by the DSi and DSi XL. So Nintendo remained pretty consistent with that, which meant, like, if you bought pretty much any Nintendo handheld within the past, like, nearly 10 years, you probably had, like, a 3DS charger laying around. But that's awfully presumptuous of them to assume you just have a 3DS charger lying around. I'm like, buddy, like during the 3DS generation, Nintendo wasn't at the top of their game. You can't assume they just already have like a charger for your previous systems lying around. Especially when that charger isn't just like an industry standard charger, it's a Nintendo standard charger. But again, Nintendo wasn't at the top of their game this generation, so it's just like, yeah, who the hell has a 3DS charger lying around? Like if the Switch Lite didn't come with a charger, that'd be annoying, but at least like I kind of understand based on the fact that it's like USB-C, and it's just like a lot of things use USB-C. But again, at the same time, I'd still be annoyed if that didn't come with a charger. So the fact that the new 3DS and new 3DS XL didn't come with a charger, come on, man. And then finally, I think the biggest problem with the new 3DS and new 3DS XL is getting to the micro SD card slot. It is like, it feels like you're gonna break the damn system doing that. So like all the other 3DS systems have just like an SD card slot. It's just a flap you can just open whenever you want. On these systems, you have to unscrew the back of the system. And that's also annoying for the regular size new 3DS because, you know, the whole thing with that is that like, oh, you can change the faceplates and everything. You know, the top screen, you can just, you know, pry that off with your fingernails. The bottom, you still have to use the screwdriver, which I just feel like kind of makes the faceplate idea like a lot less effective. But on top of that, you know, you have to do that to change your SD card. Now, like, how many times are you actually going to change your micro SD card? You know, not very often, but still, like, that one time you got to do it, it sucks. But at the end of the day, this is the handheld I'd recommend to literally anybody who wants to play not only 3DS but DS games as well. And now on top of that, like, yeah, if you hack it, you can just add a bunch of stuff. Or even like back in the day when the eShop was open, just, you know, having all of these virtual console games on there, you know, when you could just buy them, you know, that was really great. You know, having all these Game Boy Color games, NES, Super Nintendo games, all the eShop games itself was like, oh my god, you had DSiWare games on the 3DS eShop, and it all downloaded like much better than a regular 3DS because of the enhanced speed of the new 3DS. Overall, this is the ultimate 3DS, and you know, you can play DS games on it. Playing DS games on 3DS systems is fine. It's not ideal. I think they do look a lot better on like a DSi, but you know, it's not like they look awful on a 3DS, you know, like it's more so like, hey, it's very nice the DS games play on a 3DS. They don't look ideal, you know, the resolution is kind of blown up so they look a little blurrier than I really want them to, but at the end of the day, man, like, yeah, these are like some of the best Nintendo handhelds of all time. And speaking of which, let's throw the Game Boy Advance SP up there as well. You get everything with the Game Boy Advance SP. Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games, on top of the fact that you can actually see them. The new lit screen of the Game Boy Advance SP was one of the biggest game changers in Nintendo handheld history. Which is really embarrassing that it took until like 2003 to do that. Competitors to the original Game Boy handheld had backlit screens, and they were fully color as well, but Nintendo kept it through until 2003. Well, you had the Game Boy Light, which, we might as well talk about that. Let's set that in C tier. Yeah, let's talk about both of these at once. The two titans of Nintendo handheld systems that initiated a lit screen. The Game Boy Light is just kind of weird. The Game Boy Light only released in Japan right before the Game Boy Color launched. So I think Nintendo was kind of thinking like, hey, let's have two Game Boys out where you get, okay, so you can have like the brand new Game Boy Color with a color screen, and you can play some exclusive games on that. Or you could have the Game Boy Light, which just plays like all your Game Boy games, but you have a lit screen. And yeah, that just kind of felt like kind of a dumb thing to make consumers decide between, especially considering Nintendo's competitors throughout the years at this point, like Game Gear and Atari Lynx, both had color screens that were backlit. And now you have Game Boy Color versus Game Boy Light. Which one do you pick? I'm gonna pick the Game Boy Color at that point, man. The Game Boy Light is cute, but okay, first off, the light is like, that light is really only useful in pitch dark. It is like this weird little bluish greenish light, and it helps. It does the job, but like, it doesn't help during the daytime. Of course, like, a lot of lights don't help during the daytime, but I mean, like, I at least know, like, the Game Boy Advance SP, the AGS 101 model, so you have the original model of the Game Boy Advance SP, that has a lit screen, it does the job. But then you have the upgraded Game Boy Advance SP, which is just kind of like, like, it's just a different model number, but it has the best damn screen of any Game Boy Advance. Maybe Game Boy Micro is a little better, but yeah, I mean, like, that makes things way more viewable, even during the daytime, that's what I'm talking about. Of course, the technology was improved by the time they released that. But think about this, man. You had the Game Boy Light released in, like, what, like 1998? Then you had the Game Boy Advance SP in 2003? 5 years! Think about what was, like, 5 years ago from today. Feels like nothing's changed. Now, of course, like, that's comparing today to, like, 20 years ago. 5 years was a lot more of a substantial leap back then than it is now. It's just kind of funny to look back on, where it's like, yeah, 5 years later, you have, like, the Game Boy Advance SP. 5 years before, you had the damn Game Boy Light. Game Boy Light, again, it's more of a novelty at this point. I do remember I did say, like, Game Boy Micro is like, it was a bit of a failure, but Game Boy Light was definitely the biggest failure of the Game Boy line. That and the Game Boy Micro both feel like experiments, like, not necessarily like big new versions of the Game Boy line that Nintendo felt very confident in. They just kind of felt like they kind of farted both of those out. But even then, the Game Boy Micro, I feel like, has a lot more value than the Game Boy Light. I'd say the Game Boy Light goes at the very bottom of C tier. The Game Boy Advance SP plays literally all Game Boy games with a funky, fresh design. Now, I loved this design, but these days, like, I've seen, like, so many people do these modifications of the original Game Boy Advance where that has a backlit screen. Playing more of the Game Boy Advance, the original model, like, I'm like, yeah, this is a lot more comfortable. I think this just feels really good. So, like, yeah, I would say, like, it feels like the definitive Game Boy Advance would be like, hey, like, you have the body of the Game Boy Advance, the original model, but then you have all the upgrades of the Game Boy Advance SP, which also includes, like, hey, you have a rechargeable battery. That's something. But all that doesn't really even mean that the Game Boy Advance SP is, like, uncomfortable or anything. I just think the original model is more comfortable. But at the end of the day, there ain't nothing wrong with the Game Boy Advance SP. I'd say the only major problem is the fact that it doesn't have a headphone jack. That's just kind of weird. But you can buy an adapter. At this point, like, Yeah, that is the Game Boy I think everybody knows they have to buy if they want to play like all the Game Boy games. It's damn near the AGS 101 model is damn near flawless. The original model, it's a great upgrade, but yeah, you know, like that upgrade to the screen that you get with the AGS 101. Wow, I might as well talk about like the Game Boy Advance, the original model. I think that belongs in A tier. I'm gonna put that below the Nintendo Switch Lite. Just for the reasons why I talked about there. You know, like, hey, very similar to the Game Boy Advance SP. You know, you can play all your Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance games. But again, you know, at that point in 2001, like, I feel like it should have been right out the gate. Like, you should have had a backlit screen. It's weird that it didn't have that. In fact, I think this model kind of made it so then Game Boy Advance games kind of looked weird for a little bit there. You know, like a lot of Game Boy Advance games, specifically games that were ported from other systems. So, you know, let's look at like Super Mario World, Super Mario Advance 2. You look at like the color palette in that game and they had to overexpose everything. They had to brighten everything up. You know, if it wasn't for that Game Boy Advance ass screen, you know, it's like, I don't know, a lot of the library might have looked a little better since they didn't have to take into account the fact that, like, oh, a good chunk of Game Boy Advance owners have a screen that they can't even see, really. But I mean, it is a damn comfortable, really nice form factor. You know, it's the first Game Boy, really one of the only Game Boys outside of the Game Boy Micro that had that, you know, horizontal form factor, and that's a little more comfortable than something that's like a vertical, you know, something vertical you're holding with your hands like that. And now you have the Game Boy Advance library and backwards compatibility with all other Game Boy games, so it's like, yeah, it belongs in A, but like, you know, obviously the main choice, you know, if we're talking about the original releases, you know, no mods necessary or whatever, it's gonna be below the original Game Boy Advance SP. I'm sorry. But you know what's better? Boom! The Nintendo DS Lite. The Nintendo DS Lite and the Game Boy Advance SP, I think, both share, like, the title for some of the best Nintendo console redesigns. The DS Lite was just this monumental upgrade in every way. The only main problem it has compared to the original Nintendo DS model is the fact that when you stick a Game Boy Advance cartridge in the system, it juts out. It's not flush like the original DS was. But even then, like, is that really a problem? If anything, I think that adds spunk. The original DS, you know, let's rate that right now. I hate this thing. It is a pile of garbage. Yes, you can play DS games on it, but barely. Like, the screen is god awful on these. And like, they are withering away with time, man. Like, these literally feel like they're about to snap in half when I open them up from being closed. You have a great lineup of games there, but like, I'm gonna have to rate it like high C, because like, the quality of the system itself is so god fucking awful at this point. The games are great, but at the same time, like, the screen, yeah, it's backlit, but it's just like, it's so dim. It is just, it doesn't age well. I don't even know what it was like when it was brand new, but like right now, like, oh my god, it is bad. DS Lite, you know, yeah, the screen could be brighter, but like, it's a good screen. Like, you can see it, you can use it. And the original DS is damn ugly. The DS Lite is like, oh my god, it just looks like such a nice, beautiful little device. I love how it looks. It's just, it refines everything. It feels like a brand new system. You know, the original DS, it feels like it was a completely different handheld from 2004 to 2006. And then you have the DS Lite, and then it feels like the DS Lite really catapulted the DS into a brand new direction. It's almost like the original DS didn't even exist, man. So the DS Lite is like a ton more usable. I think the only other problem I can think of, you know, outside of the GBA slot thing, you know, I thought of a second one, you know, but it uses a different charger. You know, it uses a different charger from the original DS, which thankfully used the same charger as the Game Boy Advance SP. Different charger from the Game Boy Micro. The Game Boy Micro had a different charger, but the DS Lite has a different charger than any other DS system. The DS Lite charger is unique to only it. What a crock! But at the end of the day, I would say, yes, the DS Lite is probably like the definitive DS to get. But is it? Here we have the DSi and DSi XL. This is a little tricky because, these are upgrades to the DS Lite. I think they feel a lot better. I think they look a lot better. I think the screens are better. It's not like the DS Lite was bad in any of those categories, but I think the DSi is a better piece of hardware. overall. The fact that like even just using it is very much like going from an original 3DS to the new 3DS line of systems. You know, the whole thing is snappier. The fact is like you have a much better menu user interface here. The original DS systems, like if you would eject a game card while the system was on, like you couldn't do that. You'd have to turn the system off, turn it back on, and then you would see your new game appear. If you went into the settings with the original DS or DS Lite and change anything, it would tell you, okay, now you have to turn off the system and turn it back on. The DSi and DSi XL actually feel like modern systems, or at least at the time they felt like modern systems. You know, obviously like compared to like a PSP, they were, you know, lesser. They couldn't do as much, but, you know, they still felt like a little more on par with like what you'd expect from like a handheld at that time. Because the DS, you know, originating back in 2004, you know, that's a completely different ballpark from like where the DS ended up in like 2010, you know? Like that was still during the GameCube, Game Boy Advance days. By 2010, the video game industry, like the Kinect was about to launch, you know? So I think the DSi and DSi XL did a good amount to like modernize that experience. The problem is you get rid of the Game Boy Advance slot, so already you lose like a huge amount of functionality with that handheld. Thing is, at this point, like I do kind of feel like, you know, if you want to play Game Boy Advance games, you might as well just get like a Game Boy Advance SP, and then you could play original Game Boy games as well, because either way, the DS Lite and DS couldn't play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, could only play GBA games. Either way, I would say, like, if you just want to own, like, the smallest amount of Nintendo handhelds to play, like, all of the games, honestly, I think, like, the best move would be something like a Game Boy Advance SP and a new 3DS XL, you know? Because that way you can play all Game Boy games, and you can play all DS/3DS games. The DS Lite and original DS, you know, it's great that they play Game Boy Advance games, and there are a select few original DS games that utilize that Game Boy Advance slot, most notably like the Guitar Hero games. But like, what are the DS games you want to play? Are they games that use the Game Boy Advance slot? If you have a DS Lite or original DS right now, when was the last time you actually played a Game Boy Advance game on them? I'm gonna be honest, I don't even remember the last time I played a Game Boy Advance game on my DS systems. And I think the DSi introduced like a brand new thing that like really did like bring a ton of value to it, and that is the DSi shop, where you could download brand new DSiWare games. Now, here's the thing. Firstly, that service is gone. Regardless, I mean, back in the day, you know, hey, that's a ton of value. There were some good DSiWare games. Problem is, I do think a good chunk of the DSi shop, like DSiWare game catalog, was a lot of crap. You know, let's be honest. So much of that shop was flooded with these DSiWare games that were just cut down versions of original DS games. So it's like you had, you know, the Puzzle League Express game, which was just a smaller version of Planet Puzzle League on the DS. Or you had Clubhouse Games Express, which was just a selection of Clubhouse Games mini games or something, you know, just a bunch of stuff like that. But at the same time, you had Flipnote Studio, like animation software that was really, really good. Shantae Risky's Revenge, that's a big one. You know, DSiWare had a handful of great experiences, but, you know, comparing DSiWare to the entirety of the Game Boy Advance library, I think the Game Boy Advance library wins hands down. But even then, at this point, DSiWare really can't officially be accessed on DSi anymore. But the DSi has some fun things in it. You know, the camera, you have the sound application, you have a bunch of stuff like that that I think make it like a fun handheld. I think it has to go top of A. I think the DSi might be like the definitive DS system to play like DS games on. You know, the screens are a lot nicer. You know, just using the system is much more user-friendly than a DS Lite. You know, everything runs a lot better. It's much smoother, much faster. Menu system is great. The DSiWare was like a nice little like bonus thing. You know, it was cool to be able to download games onto your DS and just have like a couple games you could just access whenever. And the DSi XL, you know, that was more so like marketed towards the elderly back then, whereas like when you get to 3DS XL and new 3DS XL, those are more so marketed as like, oh, this is like the pro version, this is for the person that's serious. The DSi XL was for people that were serious about politics, the color burgundy, grits, generational trauma, but I would say like the bigger screens are incredibly nice. Like, you know, I'd say like DSi XL versus DSi, you know, it is kind of down to preference there. You know, I would kind of like playing on a DSi XL these days, but overall, I would say like, you know, you get a little less with the DSi, but you get a little bit more. I would say the DS Lite is still like the definitive model. I still think like if you want like an original DS unit to play DS games, I'd say the DSi might be the way to go, but I think DS Lite is more of kind of a safe bet for like everything. When you want to play like basically everything the DS has to offer, especially when it comes to games that use the GBA slot, you want a DS Lite. But to be fair, there are a couple of games that have DSi exclusive features, like I think the iCarly game does that. But you also have a couple of DSi exclusive retail games like Photo Showdown and Picture Perfect Hair Salon. Most of these absolutely don't need the DSi. I don't know why some of these are DSi exclusive games. Like Photo Showdown, sure, but I think Picture Perfect Hair Salon, it just has like one little thing in there where it's like, oh, you can take your picture if you want. And I'm like, what makes this any different from like a regular DS game that has DSi enhanced features like iCarly, like I said there? But either way, DSi and DSi XL, they're good DSs. I'm putting them right below the Nintendo Switch Lite in A tier. All right, man, where does the original Game Boy go? Because like this thing is, I mean, this thing started a revolution. But at what cost? This thing is a chunk. It is damn near impossible to play these days. Well, maybe not entirely, but like, damn, that screen is bad. But that library is pretty good. You know, there's some great original Game Boy games. You know, the Game Boy library is fun to go back to. I remember when they started re-releasing Game Boy games on the 3DS Virtual Console, I found Game Boy games to be a lot more fun to just check out and just dick around with compared to NES games, especially when like they brought Game Boy to like Nintendo Switch Online. Like, I'm tired of seeing all these NES games, but Game Boy games, like, these don't get re-released as much. This is kind of fun. And it's almost cuter, you know, the fact that they have, like, so many limitations and they aren't, like, amazing in many ways. You know, like, I think it's a lot more easy to forgive, like, a Game Boy game that doesn't age well compared to an NES game. Just because, like, yeah, it's a Game Boy game, you know? What do you expect? I think the original Game Boy feels good in the hands. I think the buttons are very substantial feeling. It feels like just a really good set of buttons, and it's so chunky in your hands, like, it's hard to feel uncomfortable using an original Game Boy with anything but the screen. The screen is fucking atrocious. Not just the fact that it's, like, black and white, it's green, all this stuff. It is so, like, blurry. Like when there's a lot of motion in an original Game Boy game, if you're playing like, let's say, Super Mario Land 2 and you are just cruising through a level, like, that screen gets really blurry. There's so much ghosting. It doesn't do motion well. I genuinely do think some Game Boy games are damn near unplayable on the original model. Yes, back in the day, you had to make do, so it's just like, I think a lot of people will say it's just like, but I can play every Game Boy game on the original Game Boy model. Oh, that's great. Why would you at this point? You have no reason to do this anymore. I think this is going in like C tier, man, because it's just like the original Game Boy has a great little library. Game Boy games are so cute. But damn, man. I think this has to go below the Game Boy Lite. Definitely below. Hell, this might be a high D. I don't know. I think the library does save it, but like when you can barely play it on here, it's just like, does it? Well, that brings me to the Game Boy Pocket. I think the Game Boy Pocket belongs in B. So I do like the Game Boy library. You know, the thing is, like, a lot of the Game Boy games are kind of just like crappy NES downgrades, NES demakes, or Super Nintendo demakes, you know. But, you know, the good Game Boy games are still quite good, you know, like they are a fun time. And at that point, I think, you know, we bring the Game Boy Color in high B. I think that makes sense. So the Game Boy Pocket is an actual usable original Game Boy. The screen is significantly better. I think if you want to play Game Boy games like you did back in the 90s, Game Boy Pocket, you know, might be the solid way to go in terms of like the original lineup of original Game Boys. Game Boy Color was a nice little upgrade, but that's the thing. It is kind of a little upgrade, but at the same time it isn't. Nintendo classifies the Game Boy Color as just an upgrade to the original Game Boy. The Game Boy Color and Game Boy are both the same, like, system. You know, it's not like the Game Boy Color is the sequel to the original Game Boy. I've always had problems with that statement. I've always thought the Game Boy Color was the genuine sequel, especially considering all the exclusive games you have on it. Like, you know, there are a bunch of games that work on the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Those are like the black cartridges for the original Game Boy. But then you have all the translucent Game Boy Color cartridges. Those are only playable on the original Game Boy Color, and there are a lot of those. Way more than the new 3DS, which only has 4 goddamn games, and you're gonna tell me the Game Boy Color is basically the same thing? I don't think so. I'd say anything pre-Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color is the way to go when it comes to playing original Game Boy games or Game Boy Color games. Naturally, like, oh, Game Boy Color is the best way to play Game Boy Color games before anything that came out after. What? And the Game Boy Pocket was good for what it is, but, you know, it definitely kind of got, you know, there's really no reason to go back to it other than, like, as a novelty if you have the Game Boy Color, and especially if you have, like, a Game Boy Advance SP. And the Game Boy Color does have a fair amount of really solid games, especially exclusive games. But at the same time, it's kind of like, damn, you took this long to get a color screen. It's not even backlit. And like at this point, the original Game Boy was 10 years old. And like, keep in mind, remember the original thing I said where it's like, oh yeah, you know, think about it. Game Boy Light to Game Boy Advance SP. That was only 5 years later. It was 10 years for Game Boy to Game Boy Color. Like from 1989 to 1999. Like that's like, what, man? Like that must have felt like it was like 30 years. Damn. We're stuck with a couple of 3DS models here. This is a little tricky, man, because, you know, most of these 3DS models, you know, play the games perfectly fine. You know, I think you could definitely get by with, like, any 3DS model. This is kind of just down to personal preference, you know. I think the new 3DS and new 3DS XL are the definitive models. I think it's kind of weird if you don't think that. But all right, how about this? The original 3DS model, released in 2011, we're going to put at the top of B tier. I think that's a fair place to put it. The original 3DS, I think you could definitely get by with just that throughout the entire generation. I think it is a far better first design than the original DS. There aren't any inherent, like, massive flaws with it. It's just a little uncomfortable. It's a little ugly. It's not entirely ugly. Like, it just has some funkiness to it. The battery life isn't good. But the 3DS lineup is quite excellent. Though I will definitely say the 3DS XL is far better, and I would put that at the bottom of A tier. The original 2DS is kind of tricky to place because this is definitely like, this is 3DS on a budget. It's meant to be cheaper. Everything about it is meant to be cheaper, and you know that going into it. I think the original starting price for this was like $130, and then it eventually went down to like $80. You could get a 2DS pre-installed with Mario Kart 7 for $80. Which is crazy. And some people think the 2DS is like one of the most comfortable systems Nintendo's ever put out. I am not one of those people, but I do respect it. I will give it like bottom of B tier, but I'm not a fan of it really. And the same with the new 2DS XL. I'm not a fan of this one. I think it feels cheap. I don't really like it that much. I think I'll probably put it like above the regular 2DS. I mean, it plays everything. The thing is, like, since it's a new 3DS system, technically, you get, like, everything with it. You can play all your new 3DS software, and it does run a little better. I'm gonna put it below the original 3DS. I think the original 3DS felt a little more premium, and I like how it felt a lot better. The new 2DS XL, if it didn't play everything, I'd honestly put it at the bottom of B tier, maybe even C tier, because, like, yeah, it just feels cheap, man. I don't like how it feels, but, you know, you gotta respect it. You know, it can play a lot of games, and it's not like it feels horrible or anything. But the original 3DS, like, you can definitely get by with that. It's a solid little system, but, like, it definitely could have been better. And I think the 3DS XL was a definite upgrade for it. But again, you know, why is it below everything else? That's another one where it just feels a little cheap. You can tell they kind of cost cut in a couple of areas. Even, like, the little 3D slider on the top, it just feels a lot cheaper than the original 3DS, or even like whatever, like the new 3DS XL, all of that. Like, I don't know, there's just a lot about the 3DS XL that just doesn't feel as premium, I think. And the 2DS, I respect it, man. I respect the fact that, like, you get all that crap in such a low little price. I just hate using that thing. I hate how I feel like my hands are gonna fall asleep using that thing. But yeah, this is my definitive ranking of all the Nintendo handhelds. And I feel pretty damn good about this. I can't really foresee me ever really changing anything except, how about let's put this down there and this up here and this over there and over here and right there and put that right there and then put this up there and then put that there and then put this over here and then put that right there and then put that up here. Actually put it down there and then actually put this up there and put that right there. Okay, now it's good.